was born in Wadesboro, North Carolina, grew up in Wilson. He received 2 electrical engineering degrees, one from Duke and one from NC State University. Currently, he's the CEO of Electric Supply Company of North Carolina, Incorporated. Dr. Kennedy has been a wonderful supporter of Barton and the Hackney Library, and for that, we thank him very much. He will be speaking about his passion for rare books and for Scottish writers. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Katie Kennedy, Jr.
Well, you might ask yourself, what is somebody who got degrees in electrical engineering doing, being interested in rare books and English? Well, no one ever taught me that before. They didn't teach me that at Duke. And so I came over to Barton and they wanted to teach me something about rare books. I said, fine, let's do it. And then I got to know Dr. Scott down at South Carolina because I became interested in Robert Burns and Mike Kennedy's, who came up in Scotland. And he was very nice to Sarah Lynn and myself down when we visited down there, because they were the world's, or at least the United States, main repository of Robert Burns' literature and first editions and so forth. And so he kind of got me started in this whole thing, because I can see the flame of interest in his eyes, and he still has it today. And he's continuing on and giving of himself to schools like Barton freely to help us be stronger and to educate more people, more kids, in the direction of in-depth learning about these great writers that they've heard about. So, why do we have a rare book room? Other than what I've said, it is a way to really, as they say nowadays, drill down deeper into the subject of books and of learning and of history and of writing and all the main things that we're supposed to teach and learn at a college, university of higher education. But it's quite addictive to get involved in rare books, because it's something that you can learn for many lifetimes about without ever reaching the bottom of the barrel of information that can come from there. So I have a good time with it. I collect for Barton, I collect for myself. I continually learn from Patrick Scott and Rob. I learn from Rob and George Loveland, and anybody who's got a bit of knowledge about the history or the writing of people from the past. Now, we there's a lot of reasons to have a rare book room, and we've talked about that on many occasions, but it adds to Barton. Not too many colleges of our size have rare book rooms, and it gives us a niche. It gives us kind of a wow factor that a lot of the colleges your size don't have. I mean, if you go out and you're a conference here, I doubt if there's another one that have rare book rooms. There may be one or two, but certainly not all of them. So I think it helps all the students and the area quite a bit in that way. It aids the professor's mission. If they will use it right, they can assign papers and say, now, I don't want you to get it off the internet. I don't want you to get it out of a book that was printed 5 years ago. I want you to go and take it from these original first editions that somebody has gone out and collected for you. Now, we must have, we're approaching 500 first editions here now, and the first edition is something that is very rare. I mean, that's the first time, it was printed by this Arthur, and that's kind of unusual. We also have, we have at least one letter here written by Sir Walter Scott in his own hand with his own seal. The original letter he wrote to two of his associates while writing some short stories. So I mean, that's kind of cool to pick that up and hold it and say, well, this is the man's original work. This is his original thinking right here. He used a quill to do this. I think that's pretty amazing. You know, it deepens the offering we have here. It gives you books that are hot off the press. You know, maybe it's 200 years ago, but they're still just as fresh as they were then. We have sort of specialized. I've had an interest in Scottish writers, so we've kind of specialized in that, and we have a lot of Robert Burns, a lot of Sir Walter Scott, and a smattering of many others, as well as English writers, Irish writers. I don't know if we have anybody from Wales or not, but we're sort of focusing on that as far as writers are concerned. We have two other collections in our rare book room. One is the history of Barton, which we are working on very hard, and Shannon Wilson has done a real good job of uncovering many things in that area. And as Rob was saying, we've got a case back here in which we have the very beginning of Barton, and we're getting more and more information from folks like you who want to give it to us or lend it to us or give us the information about it. So we need to know more about the beginnings, every little detail of Atlantic Christian. The other collection is the Disciples of Christ collection, going back to the starting of it in our area, and why the school is named Barton, and why isn't it named Campbell, and all the other circuit riders at the time, and how the Christian church played into Atlantic Christian coming along, and the various preachers, the various presidents, how they related one to the other. That's also a very interesting area, and we do that, quite frankly, for the Southeast United States. So we're kind of carrying the petard and the flag for the whole Christian church, Disciples of Christ movement for the Southeast United States, or most of it, So that's a good feeling to be doing that. We welcome any of your ideas about how we can make the Rare Book Room better. We welcome any of your ideas on what kind of collections we should have, in addition to the three that we're now mainly focused on. We're not focused on a lot of things. We're not focused on North Carolina history. We're not focused on any other subject than the three I spoke of at this point, but we could, especially if we have funding from people who would like to do that, and if it's pertinent to this body of people here at Atlantic Christian. Now, Sir Walter Scott, I'm not going to say a whole lot about it because my time is about to run out, but the thing I sense the most about him is that he always persevered. If I had to put one word on what he is all about, I think I would call him a person who persevered. And Dr. Scott may have another word that's better than mine because he knows a whole lot more about Scott than I do. But at 2 years old, he had polio and limped for the rest of his life. He wrote hundreds of poems and 40 plus novels about stories that his grandmother and others told him while he was sick and couldn't get out of his bed and couldn't walk. He absorbed these character traits and parts and started assimilating his novels when he was 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. Now I know college is different than it was then, but he entered at 8 years old. He entered the Edinburgh High School. This is in 1779. The American Revolution is going on at this time, just to put it in context. At 12 years old, he attended Edinburgh University. So maybe times are different, but he was certainly seeking information and learning. There's no question about that. He wrote a book called Rob Roy, and he kind of based that on meeting a gentleman who was a friend of his father, Alexander Stewart, who had once fought a duel with Rob Roy. So it's kind of like I don't know what happened in the duel. I just know that he did have a duel. I think it must have ended in a tie. I don't think Dr. Scott can tell you. But he fashioned all his heroes and heroines on people that he met or stories that he heard, and I don't know about you, but I can't remember but about a week and a half, stories I've heard. But he kept them for 50 years before he started writing the story. I mean, he had an amazing brain, no question about that. He was sick on and off his entire life. He went to baths to get himself better, to strengthen himself. He had gallstones, he had kidney problems, he had heart problems, strokes, and yet he fought through this, and especially in his last 10 years or 15 years of life, he wrote most of his novels. Died at 62, but he was still chugging, to the end. And I respect anybody that's got that kind of zip to them. Kind of didn't care about, he has a magnificent home there that he finally paid off, and but he wasn't financially wealthy at the end, but he did make arrangements to pay all his debt, so you have to give him credit for that. But I'd say he's one of the 5 most outstanding writers that ever came out of Scotland, which would include Adam Smith, Wealth of the Nations. You've all heard that. David Hume, who was probably one of the greatest philosophers in the history of time. Robert Burns, who is still thought of as the outstanding poet in Scotland, and amazing poet, and just really all these guys were genius. And Robert Louis Stevenson and Sir Walter Scott, they were the 5 that I think were the most outstanding. And I want to see what Patrick's list is all about when he gets up here. But thank you so much for coming, and I want you to read Ivanhoe, Rob Roy, Marmion, which is a wonderful long poem about the Scottish War against the English in 1513 at Flodden, if you ever heard of the Flodden battlefield. But I mean, he came up with new characters, who fought this war, and some based on history, but a lot of it based on just what, as a kid, he learned by walking over the battlefield. And an amazing man. I'm glad we are honoring him with this seminar today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. Our next speaker is Barton's own Professor Shawn McCauley. Professor McCauley earned his Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts degree in English at East Carolina University, and he is currently a doctoral candidate at Emory University in Atlanta. His dissertation, Between Bodies, Reconstructing Corporate Reality in Early Modern England, focuses on representations of the human body in works of Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, and John Donne, and how these texts relate to the historical, philosophical, and medical context of the Renaissance. Professor McCauley joined the Barton College faculty in 2010 and has since taught courses in freshman composition, British literature, Shakespeare, and American and Western culture. He has previously held teaching appointments at East Carolina University and also at Barry College in Rome, Georgia. His talk today will focus on the materiality of Sir Walter Scott's poetry books. Please join me in welcoming Professor Shawn McCauley.
I have a handout. preface all of this with two general comments. One, which in particular is aimed at my students, I do indeed own a tie. The second one is a more general thing that I know precious little about Sir Walter Scott. Somehow I managed to make it through a bachelor's degree in English, a master's degree in English, and all of my coursework for a PhD, focusing on British literature, and until I've started working on this presentation, had never read a word of Sir Walter Scott. And I was kind of terrified when Dr. Kanya sent me an email and said, hey, can you give a presentation on Sir Walter Scott? And part of me, I guess, felt like I was given, the proverbial offer that you can't refuse. And part of me wanted to say, no, I'm not qualified, find somebody else. I knew Dr. Patrick Scott was going to be here, and thankfully I'm going in front of him instead of having to follow him, someone who actually knows what he's talking about. The other part of me, though, took it as sort of a challenge, as I'm someone who, for a living, teaches classes and asks students to write papers and give presentations on things that they don't really know very much about. And I see students nodding as I say that. And so I thought, sure, I'll flip it around this time and see where I go. And that's sort of what my title is about here, Lines of Inquiry, sort of punning on the poetic lines that Sir Walter Scott has written, but also trying to figure out a way to sort of wrap my arms around this topic and do something I hope is somewhat interesting with it. And then I've got a subtitle there, Text and Paratext in Scott's The Lady of the Lake. I'm going to start not with Scott, but with Shakespeare. As you heard as an introduction, that's more kind of in my wheelhouse. I think one of the reasons that I was sort of called upon to do this, other than being the resident British Lit scholar here on campus, is Dr. Kanya knows that I have an interest in rare books. Last semester, I took my Shakespeare class up into the marvelous rare book room up there, and we did sort of a very brief compare and contrast between, we have a facsimile of Shakespeare's first folio up there, and I ran some photocopies of our little, trade paperback $4 version Penguin Othello that we were reading at the time. And we went up there and just talked about texts and where they come from and their sort of malleability and the fact that we can't really put a pin in any particular, Shakespearean work and where those words that we read today come from. It was a productive discussion. And so I just put these images up there. This is an image from Coriolanus in the first folio, and this is the version that I use in class. This is the one I assign anyway. Whether or not it's the one that students use is a separate question. Because to students, and this is the handout that I gave you, a text is just a text. It's just words that are on a page. Students do not care by and large about this term paratext, which I'll get to in a little bit. They just want to know, I want to read the play, I want to read the poem, give me the words. Hopefully it's portable, whether it's a paperback that I can put in my backpack or it's something that's on my Kindle, on my iPad, etc. Just give me the words so I can read it, help me to understand. It's sort of the second introduction. As I was working on this, a thought came to my mind. I have this memory of when I was an undergrad at ECU, and one of my favorite days, because English professor nerd, I will gladly own that. One of my favorite days was going to buy books at the beginning of the semester. And the way that it was set up in Greenville at ECU was there was the University Bookstore, UBE, downtown. And upstairs was where they kept all the books. And normally it was sort of off limits, except during those windows of time at the beginning of the semester. And at the beginning of the semester it would open up and you would go and get a shopping basket like you were at Harris Teeter. And you would go up there and you were kind of lost and sort of, especially that first, second year, didn't quite know what you were doing. And you'd wander around as if you were in the produce department and carefully pick out the books that you wanted to use for the semester. And for some people this was a chore, but for me it was sort of a joy. That weird moment of kind of pretending like you know what you're doing. If you've ever bought a cantaloupe in Harris Theater, right? You smell it, or you're thumping it, you're shaking it and listening to it. Oh, this one seems good. Well, one of my best memories was going and picking up these books. And in thinking about this, I'm convinced, and this is, I'm so out of date now because this is way back, books didn't exist at this point. Your two options were either you got the new, wrapped in the cellophane, never been opened version, or you got the used version. Back then, there were two kinds of people. People who either opted for a text that looked like this, clean, I don't want anybody else's nonsense getting in the way of my reading of this text. And I was very much that person. Or people who wanted these things. If I can be permitted sort of a third introduction here. Still, I'm not talking about Scott. I thought this up and thought, man, this would be a cool thing to use for an introduction. And so I went to our bookstore and tried to track down two different versions of the same text, one that was clean and one that was marked up. And it took us almost an hour of going through stacks of books, trying to find ones that had been written in. It's so hard to get students, as a teacher, to actually interact with text. There's a sort of line of, I don't want to mess it up, maybe it's because I want to get all my money back, or whatever the rationale for it is. But these are things that are meant to be interacted with. So, Scott. Knowing nothing about Scott, I started just doing some general research and found out all kinds of cool, amazing, interesting things about him that would make for wonderful sort of jumping off points at something like this. And especially thinking about the poetry. Just doing general browsing on the internet, finding out things like the poem I'm going to talk about today, Lady of the Lake, that it is where the song that they play when the President of the United States shows up somewhere, Hail to the Chief, comes from that poem. Schubert's Ave Maria, one of the most famous pieces of music in existence, comes from that poem. The tradition in the KKK in the South of burning crosses in a very weird way that doesn't have anything to do with racism or intimidating people comes from that poem. And I didn't know any of this. But I thought, as interesting as those things are, they've kind of been done already. They're not in my wheelhouse. I don't think that's what I want to do. So what I did, because I'm an English professor and somewhat of a book nerd, was I went upstairs, I went to the stacks and just got all the books off of the shelves and started looking through them. And what I gave you is the text of the poem in front of me. And I won't bother you since I've taken so much time with my three introductions of reading it, but this is just the bare, unadorned poetry. They're all stacked over here. Bring them over. These are all really old. They're not necessarily rare, though. Not worth very much. This one is the Poetical Works of Sir Walter Scott, published by White and Allen around about 1888. I had to do some research online to try to guess when I thought it was published by looking at other rare book listings and things like that, because it doesn't have a copyright date on it. This is a very simple text. It's just like the handout that I gave you. It is just the text of the poem. And this is, basically the first three introductory stanzas there, and then the first two stanzas proper of the first canto. This is a different version. This is just The Lady of the Lake by Scott Forsman and Company from 1899, a little bit later. And it starts off looking very much like the previous one, just the text of the poem. But then in the back, it has a list of footnotes. If you look at this, the text of the poem, Harp of the North, the bouldering long hath hung the wych elm that shades St. Fillan's spring. And us reading that today, what does Harp of the North mean? If you know nothing about Sir Walter Scott, who's St. Fillan? you go through almost every other line of this poem, there's something that doesn't quite resonate in the way that we probably should with us today, just because we don't catch the references. And that's where these footnotes come in. The term for this, I know what a footnote is, but I sort of caught on to this as being an interesting sort of thread into Sir Walter Scott. And so I did some research and started looking around for sources related to Sir Walter Scott and footnotes. And this led me to somebody else who I sort of had heard of by name but had never read myself, a French philosopher by the name of Gerard Genet, who wrote a book called Paratexts, which is amazing and incredibly sort of tedious at the same time, where he goes through and talks about prefaces and introductions and footnotes and endnotes and where all these things come from and how they help to shape our experience of reading a text. And in the very beginning, when he's explaining what his definition of paratext is, and he likens it to a word like paramilitary, which means kind of, sort of, like the military, but not at the same time. These elements of a book that he refers to as paratext, you read them, but they're not necessarily the thing that you're reading at the same time. So he says in paratext, he says, "It is for us the means by which a text makes a book of itself, and proposes itself as such to its readers and more generally to the public. Rather than with a limit or a sealed frontier, we are dealing in this case with a threshold, an undecided zone between the inside and the outside. This fringe constitutes, between the text and what lies outside of it, a zone not just of transition, but of transaction, the privileged site of a pragmatics and of a strategy, of an action on the public in the service, well or badly understood and accomplished, of a better reception of the text and a more pertinent reading." And I really like that word about transaction, that there's sort of a negotiation that takes place between you and a book when you sit down and read it. Do you read all the stuff that's there at the beginning? Do you pause and look at the picture if there is one of the author? That's a sort of romantic era commonplace of the leisurely looking author reclining in a chair, this portrait that we have. Or do you just skip over that? Let me get to the good stuff. Do you pause? Do you read footnotes? If they're endnotes, do you bother to read endnotes? One of the things as a teacher, it's a struggle to get students to read footnotes and endnotes. They seem sort of optional, and in some cases they are. One of the things when I do teach Shakespeare that I feel like I have to sort of train students to do is to figure out which footnotes to read. Because they shouldn't just skip all of them, but if they sit there and read every single one of them, they'll never finish the 2 acts of the play that I want them to read. So you have to sort of develop a skill and a ability to sort of negotiate with a book and figure out what parts of it you want to read and which ones you don't. Going through just some more of these, this is a larger view of the notes there. This is another version, a library of poetical literature in 32 volumes. And the first volume was Sir Walter Scott. Again, we see just the poem, but now we see actual footnotes appear that begin to explain things to us. That say, Binvirlic. It had kindled on Binvirlic's head. And we could explain down here, it's one of the Grampian chain of mountains at the head of the valley of the Garry. I'm not sure that helps us out all that much. We feel a little better about it, but we sort of need footnotes for our footnotes there, right? But again, this is a place to go and find out, to inquire, to follow this thread, this line, and where it's sort of pointing us at. These are just more examples. As we sort of progress, and these are in sort of semi-chronological order, the poetical works of Sir Walter Scott, 1880. We get the same footnotes from the previous one. And then we also get endnotes at the end. And these are endnotes that were actually, these are written by Scott. They were included in the first edition. These are ones from the first major edited edition, which his name escapes me right now at this moment, but that get copied in version after version. So I'm upstairs, I'm going through all these books, and I'm okay, well, this is fairly interesting. And then I hit this thing, which is this little unassuming book. Scott's Lady of the Lake, the kind of thing that I might assign. It reminds me a lot of the sort of little cheap $5 versions that we would use in a Shakespeare class. Scott's Lady of the Lake, American Book Company, 1910. And this was the very first page of it. This is the kind of thing that you're told not to do for a library. Right? And I have no idea what the provenance of these marks is, if this was a library book when the person that wrote these, if this was somebody's personal book that they had for school, and this is sort of a record of their reading that then got donated to a library. It's too far in the past to sort of try to figure and tease out all of these things. But the thing that really struck me as being amazing is in this sort of record of this student working with this text, because Lady of the Lake was incredibly popular in high schools at the time as a way to introduce students to poetry. It's not incredibly demanding, it's not dense in the way that Milton is. It's very lovely, it's got this sort of nice landscape quality to it. But I'm glancing at this thing, and at the top there it says iambic pentameter, which rings bells with somebody who teaches Shakespeare. And then iambic hexameter, an alexandrine. It's been searing in the stanzas. And then you can see over here in the margin, AB, ABB, ABACC, rhyme schemes. This is clearly somebody who read this book and was being sort of walked through it by an English teacher, which is so amazing to me. And this is, 100 years ago. The thing that jumps out at me, though, is not just that, the thinness of 100 years ago what an English class looked like, but the things being taught in this class. And you can go through, there's image after image after image of the person in the margins making notes of like where he was supposed to, or she, where the student was supposed to start for like Wednesday's class and then end, read this chunk, and then for the next class read this bit. But over and over and over again throughout the book, the person just writes in the margins metaphor and simile. And that's how the English teacher was approaching this text, like the nuts and the bolts of it. And you can also see where the person was reading the footnotes. They're going through and marking which ones were sort of important and which ones weren't. None of this stuff, that's a Spencerian stanza, the Spencerian stanza is iambic pentameter with a concluding alexandrine that has a certain rhyme scheme. None of that is being pointed out by Scott in his editorial notes. None of it is being pointed out by any of the editors in all these different editions. I think it's assumed that a learned reader would know that, but this is a snapshot, I think, of a book being actually read and used. Thank you. This book isn't rare. It's not tremendously valuable. It is amazing to me to see these sort of footprints, footnotes of history. And the volumes that are in the Rare Book Library are sitting up here on the table. I'm going to stop here, so I think I've used enough time. Each one of these books has so many stories to tell about history, about reading, about students, about authors, about teachers, about society, all these different questions and answers that are just waiting there for students to go and research. So thank you for your time. Hopefully that made some sense.
Thank you, Professor McCauley. Our final speaker is Dr. Patrick Scott. In addition to his serving as a distinguished professor of English at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Scott served for 15 years in his role as director of the university's Urban Department of Rare Books and Special Collections. During this period, the Urban Department of Rare Books and Special Collections added more than 100 distinct collections, largely through gifts. And in 2010, it moved into a brand new building, the Hollings Special Collections Library. The department also developed the use of special collections in education and in outreach with an expanded exhibition program, with special events and conferences, pioneered digital conferences, and also regular undergraduate courses in book history, giving students hand-on experience with rare materials. Before moving to South Carolina in 1976, he taught at the secondary level in both Nigeria and in Britain, and at the college level in Edinburgh and at the College of William and Mary. While at South Carolina, Dr. Scott taught more than 35 different courses in British literature, in writing, African literature, historical bibliography, and in rare book librarianship. Since 2012, he has edited the journal Studies in Scottish Literature. He is an honorary research fellow in Scottish literature at the University of Glasgow, and he currently has NEH support for research relating to Robert Burns. Dr. Scott has Master of Arts degrees from the Universities of Oxford and also a PhD from the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Scott will be speaking tonight on Sir Walter Scott and the novel. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Scott?
Like attending your own funeral service. I am going to talk about Walter Scott and the novel, but I'm going to talk also a little bit about Walter Scott as a whole, and I hope also a little bit about the interest of looking at him in original format, the way you can do in rare books. So it's a mix of things. He's still the great unknown. Professor McCauley's experience of not being asked to read Scott is entirely standard now. He's marginalised. To some extent, Burns is. In Scotland, they're not. But in the ordinary British literature curriculum, both of them have got squeezed out. Burns's case, partly because he wrote in Scots. In Scott's case, partly because he wrote too much, I think. It's very difficult to get a grip on him. Josh, help me. What am I meant to press? Oh, I see. Okay. All right. You go into Edinburgh, and I can move this just a little bit around here somewhere. If you go into Edinburgh and you go up Calton Hill, there, almost in the middle of nowhere, is this Greek temple, maybe 80 foot high, to Robert Burns, always voted the greatest Scot. If you go to a little bit into town, there in the centre of town is that at about 300 feet, which is the Scott Monument, which is Gothic, slightly borrowed style. Burns is absolutely logo. I mean, one portrait dominates, and absolutely recognisable from every biscuit tin in the land. Cookie can. Scott had the misfortune of living long. I have a Milton collection in South Carolina, and we got a portrait. Blessedly, it was a portrait of when he was young. Very, very difficult to get people to identify with authors who are old. Scott looked older than he was, but many of the portraits are middle-aged or old. Burns, the birthplace, famous icon, simple cottage. Scott built a baronial residence. That's a bit unfair, actually. He built that with what he earned himself, and he designed it, and both of them are now places of pilgrimage and historic residences. It gives you a sort of unfair, that's the inside. The inside is recognized as imagined by Victorians, good, toothy, poor people reading their Bible on Saturday nights. And the baronial hall. Scott got a bad rap partly because he played the administration. He was very, very involved with the process by which Scotland's disputed history, 25 years before he was born, were the last big battles on British soil at Culloden, where the Jacobites were defeated and the Hanoverians won. He was someone who believed that Great Britain should be put together, that this was an evolution, the union of the crowns was an evolution you could support, that you wanted political stability. But he also had, from his family and background, he had a sympathy with the Jacobites. And he writes about this. This was within living memory, as Katie was saying, when he was young. Well, in 1822, he managed to persuade the Prince George IV by then to come up to Scotland and make the first royal visit to Scotland, I think, since James the Sixth and First had left in 1603. And the idea was to settle, in some sense, to have a rapprochement between the Hanoverian government and the relics of Jacobite and nationalist sentiment. And he got persuaded the chiefs of all the Scottish clans to bring these token armies clad in kilts, which had been prescribed in the 18th century, bring them to Edinburgh and have these great events. And he managed to persuade George IV, improbably, to dress in a kilt with pink tights under it. But he set this up, and he got made a baronet. He was not made a baronet for writing. He was made a baronet for successfully bringing off one of the big cultural coups which had great political importance. He was inevitably regarded as a tool of government and as conservative in a bad way at that point. He was also conservative in a good way. He kept Scottish heritage alive, as they both did. So it's a sort of a bit of an unfair rap, but for much of the 19th and 20th century, he would have been regarded as someone in the 19th century who wrote great poems and great novels, but in the 20th century as somehow not someone you could square with the age of Romanticism, with the people who embraced liberty and equality and the French Revolution and all those good things. This is Burns. The prince can make a belted knight, a marquis duke and all that, but an honest man's a boon his might. Good faith he men fall at. For all that and all that, the dignities are all that, the pith of sense and pride of worth are higher ranks than all that. One is tempted to take the phrase, kind hearts are more than coronets, from Tennyson, turn it on its head and say poor bards are more than baronets. There's a sense in which he did himself in, Scott, by the pretensions for posterity. But in fact, he has many of these virtues. He really did. As he was a kid. When Burns came to Edinburgh in 1787, he would have been 15, 16. And this is a picture of a remarkably youthful 15-year-old who's already been to college by this stage and is an apprentice lawyer, sitting in the bookshop, Swivl's bookshop, on the main drag on the high street in Edinburgh, looking up and seeing Scotland's bard come in and be feted, being feted by all the great intellectuals of the age. Adam Smith, David Hume was dead, but Adam Smith, Lord Monboddo, Hugh Blair, all the great people of the Scottish Enlightenment were all sitting basically at Burns's feet during that year and a half, when he came there. And Scott saw a Scottish poet who was a hero at that point. This is the only recorded meeting, there's a later painting of it, where Burns looks at a painting on the wall and is very moved by the bit of poetry that's written underneath it and says, "Who wrote that?" The only person in the room who knows it is Walter Scott. And that's the only interaction we know between them. It's from a very obscure 18th century poet. He wasn't actually born in a baronial castle, right? He was born in a much less salubrious thing than this. This is the house next door. This bit here was where my wife had her office when she taught Scottish studies. It's in George Square. But that was a perfectly ordinary, decent professional house, just south of Edinburgh at the time. Has a little plaque on it. And that's where he was ill and came back to recuperate. He recuperated in the country. Very interrupted education. You could say, well, Burns had to educate himself. Scott went to university. University wasn't like this now. No one was helping him in the sense that these huge classes of 12 and 13-year-olds who didn't know what was going on, and you got your degree by attending enough. Right? You got a ticket of attendance. At the end of the semester, you paid your fees and took a ticket of attendance. Most people didn't graduate. He didn't graduate. He did 2 years, and then he went into his father's office to train to be a lawyer, which he did. He became a successful lawyer. He made his living. They both made their living. One made his living as a ploughman, and then as a farmer, then as an exciseman. Scott made his living, right? Pith of sense, pride of worth. So to some extent, the image is a false image which he gave himself by how he wrote. This is a summary. I may as well run through the summary because it's useful to us. Born in Edinburgh, but from a Borders family. So he had a rural background. He could see both sides of things. Became a lawyer and sheriff. Sheriff is like a county judge, but you only have to be there for some of the year to read the case, to hear the cases, and send people on to Edinburgh if it's too important to the High Court. He spent his time in the law office reading books. He educated himself. Both he and Burns educated themselves. As a young man, he was influenced by Romanticism. He translated German literature. But he got into the poetry of the culture of the countryside, the same as Burns did. Both of them published big collections of Burns of songs in the Scots Musical Museum, and Scott particularly of the Border Ballads. They weren't the first to do it, but both of them did the most influential collections of that kind at the time. They were both actually in the volunteers, in the militia. Did you know that the Second Amendment clause is influenced by the fact that the English government had tried to ban the Scots from having militias? Did you know that? And it changed in 1793. But when the Second Amendment was adopted, it was still limited. You couldn't have a militia in Scotland. And that is part of the background to that clause. Scott was inevitably an officer, and Burns was a private. But they were both part of the home defence units during the Napoleonic threat, 1793. The narrative poetry is overshadowed now. I'm very impressed, actually, that Professor McCauley chose to write on that, talk on that. It used to be how people wrote poetry. People used to be intoxicated with it. It's narrative poetry. It has a story. You can read it aloud. It's extraordinary stuff. Nobody reads it now, pretty much. And yet it is the story of Scottish history. He pretty much concealed from people when he turned to the novel. In 1814, this novel appeared, and it was anonymous. And he wouldn't tell people who it was, and he managed quite successfully to conceal it. He owned the printers, I mean, he was in partnership with the printers, and he had his novels copied out by someone else, by an amanuensis, so there wasn't a manuscript in his own handwriting. that could be uncovered. But he became this wild hit of a novel. Now, people will now say, but Maria Edgeworth was doing it in Ireland. But no, he really was. This was the pioneer thing that put the historical novel on the world stage. And every other country then had to do it. Fenimore Cooper in America, or in the South, Sims. They're all influenced. They're all trying to be the Walter Scott of wherever they are. And a lot of the only reason Scott gets taught now in high-level literature courses is because of the theoretical interest in the historical novel from people like Lukács. He wrote some great novels, which I will talk a little bit about in a minute, but he then had this awful crash. Financial collapse in 1826 bankrupted his London bookseller, who then couldn't pay the Scottish bookseller, who then couldn't pay the Scottish printer, and Scott was a partner with it. There weren't bankruptcy laws in the way there are now. They were changed soon after this. And he set out, when he was ill, quite late in life, he would have been 52? More than that. 50 something. He set out to pay back everybody, and he wrote enough to do it, pretty much. It wasn't completely paid back at the time he died, but it was payable. Extraordinary idea. Heroic writing. We think of writing as self-expression, right? As somehow ideal and above everything. He wrote it, and they're not much worse, let me tell you. The late ones. There's a wonderful novel called The Surgeon's Apprentice, which I read, which is about two brothers training to be medical people who go out to India. And it's one of these, intercultural novels that he wrote quite late in life. What he thought he was doing, I don't know, but it's one of the first good British novels about India. We make a mistake in trying to read a big fat book in one go. They came out in separate volumes. Some of them 4 volumes, some of them 3 volumes. You could binge read them if you wanted to, right? Because they came out all at once. They weren't coming out as a serial like Dickens, but they were coming out. It was something you could hold in your hand. It was something you could have print big enough to read. One of the reasons we don't read Scott is that it's all squeezed into a big fat paperback, right? Or it's in a very old edition with bad stereotype printing. But it was read in a different kind of way. It was a relatively leisurely kind of reading at a time when there was no television, certainly no cable television. No one was preoccupied with their social media. You could read. You couldn't read late at night because, light wasn't good, but light goes on late in Scotland. There are long summer evenings to read novels. What do you think he was doing? Over the course of the novels, he deals with all the big flashpoints of Scottish history. And they were all still flashpoints. I mean, nobody ever forgets anything in Scottish history, in a way. And they're all cultural clashes. He writes, for instance, about the legacy of the Covenanters. Right? He was an Episcopalian. Completely different. How are you going to read the 17th century? Who were the heroes? Here is a story where... But he starts off with Waverley. Waverley to 60 years since. And what he's doing in 1812 is he's writing about the last of the big Jacobite risings, the one under Bonnie Prince Charlie. And he takes an Englishman and he goes north, and he gets caught off from the Hanoverian forces and is taken in by a Highland chieftain, and he falls in love with a Highland girl. And eventually you get the inevitable plot at the end, which is that all is resolved, and Edward Waverley is a wiser, better man, but also a married one. It's a great story, actually, but its purpose is historical as well as being a story. Ivanhoe, the most popular one over here, is a chivalric story, but it rises out of cultural conflict. It's the conflict between the Normans, the successors of the Normans in the time of Richard II, and King John. It's the time of Robin Hood. And he takes bits of the Robin Hood story. But it's about whether the descendants of the Saxons, the previous aristocracy, if you like, the Highlanders of England, were going to survive, how they were going to, when someone else was in charge, the Normans or the Hanoverians. It's the same story in some ways that he's exploring, or the same sets of issues. And he throws into the mix medieval Jews and his heroine, Rowena, into that. It becomes one of the great love stories. It's been filmed many times. A lot of people have read it in adapted versions because it was so popular. Stories get down, they get remediated, as we say in English departments, right? Get changed. But that's one of them. Perhaps the greatest of his novels is The Heart of Midlothian, which is based on a story he'd heard when he was young about a woman who walked from Edinburgh to London to get the king to give a pardon because someone was going to be hung for infanticide, and this wasn't right. And it has lots in Scots in it. There's other things to the story, but it's thought of as one of the great Scott novels. There are lots of them. We had two letters of these, and the reason I put this in is both of these were researched by students. Both of them led to published articles. And if you do that as a student, it doesn't mean to say you're going to be an English professor, right? You're not doomed because you do research. The one on the left, that chap's a pediatrician. Went on, was at Vanderbilt and Nashville. He was a student. This chap was done by a graduate student in English. Student I had this summer, last year, is going on to law school. He worked on Burns. He did really quite original work on Burns. He was doing other research for me. So undergraduate research, because these authors are relatively neglected by academics, and because there's original material to work with of different kinds, you can do research with these people. Don't think that Walter Scott's periodical stuff has been done very much. And that's a good kind of research to do, as well as manuscripts. The most famous quote. Breathes of a man with soul so dared, who never to himself has said, "This is my own, my native land," whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand. That's the Jacobites returning, actually. Right? The exiles, coming back from exile. It's also putting together people of different classes and types in Scotland in one ideal, that you really do warm to your native land. And that would be suspect to some kinds of critics. But it's, by comparison with Burns, embracing the ordinary man. But it's a great quote. And anyone who can write things you remember or even misremember, is a great writer. So we end up with Robert Burns, Scotia's Bard, Walter Scott, the Wizard of the North. They both have labels, sobriquets. He's not just the great unknown, as he tried to be, and as sometimes we try to make it. We're scared of trying to ask people to read long novels. But if you read them for pleasure, or you research bits, manageable bits, you can get into this stuff. And I really believe he's a great writer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott. We have just a few minutes for questions. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and I can bring the mic over to you. If you have a particular presenter you'd like to answer, feel free to say that too. Any questions? Okay. I'll start. I have a question. This is for Dr. Scott. Dr. Scott, in Scotland, there's great affection and almost worship for Robert Burns and also for Sir Walter Scott both. I was wondering from an emotional standpoint, if you could talk a little bit more about how, for the Scottish people, their affection may be slightly different, or how they look upon both Burns and Scott.
Well, as always, it depends who you ask, doesn't it? But they're both used very heavily, for instance, by politicians in quotes, which is a good test of acceptability, I think. They've just reopened the railway from Edinburgh down to Abbotsford, where Scott's house. It used to be much easier to get to Burns's house than it was to Scott's, but they've just reopened the Borders Railway. And I think that will get more people going there to look at his house. Really good.
Thank you. Any other questions this evening? Well, I believe our authors will stick around just a few minutes at least. If you have any questions, feel free to speak with them. Be sure to check out the display case, and we also have lots of food left over too. So now what I'd like you to do is take out your ticket. Might have forgotten. We do have a drawing. I'm going to shake up the tickets here. The drawing prize is a beautiful 19th century edition of Scott's Marmion. And I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands of 19th century books. And this is probably the most beautiful 19th century book I've ever seen. And Marmion is a rare poem to find in a book form like this. And we'd like to thank Dr. Kennedy for the donation of the drawing tonight. So, with that, Dr. Kennedy, would you please give the honors and reach in and pull out a ticket.
Okay, the number is 5226-323.
Everyone hear that?
5226-323. Anybody have that?
Someone have that ticket? If not, we'll. Oh.
Somebody's got it because it had to tear off the other half, didn't it?
They should have, yes. Well,
Y'all all understand numbers. It's 522, 6,323.
Okay, we'll try one more time.
Sure. Somebody's just shy. They don't understand that. Okay. 522-6266. 522-6266.
I think we have a winner. Do we? 6266?
Tell us your name and what you do, and et cetera. You're obviously a student.
Yeah, I'm a student. My name is Nicole, and I'm in the nursing major.
Great.
It's pretty cool.
There you go.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so very much.
You got to have a book report next Friday. One thing I'd like to mention, Patrick showed these the three books together equaling one novel. We have three of those here, first editions, first printing. That's pretty cool. I mean, you should go up there just to see that after this lecture. Just go ask somebody to go up there with you, one of the librarians. But you can pick it up, you can touch it, look at it, leaf through it, read some of it. Well, as long as you sit in there with one of our librarians, you can sit there 8 hours. But it is a first edition. I mean, that means, it was the first time he had just come out with it. Here it is, and they're all in really good condition. We have Rob Roy, which I think I mentioned. He wrote after he met the man who had dueled with Rob Roy. it going through you when you do this. So like, oh, geez, what was that? It was a bolt of something. But it's just, living with a very creative person for a moment. Pretty cool. And we have a gift today of which actually came from New Zealand, but it was one of the first editions, probably the second edition, of his whole canon of poetry in 10 volumes. And Dr. Scott said it's one of the nicest he's ever seen. It's in the original boards, the original paper, the outside. It's in very good condition, so you can handle that, look at it, read it, and it'd be a fun thing to do someday. And go back to your English class and talk about it, and you've got to get a better grade because of extra credit.
The speakers did make donations today to the Rare Book Room. I'd like to thank them so much for that. And would you all please join me now in thanking our guest speakers for today. At this time, I'd like to close the program. There is more food in the back. Please feel free to take some food. And don't forget, Day of Scholarship tomorrow. Thank you all very much for coming.